Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, I had alluded to this last week in my lecture on security issues, exponential vulnerability, but the rules of machine learning are being rewritten right now. There's all sorts of amazing things happening in terms of privacy-preserving technology. So I'm going to turn it over to Anish to walk you through that and explain how it's going. Please.
Hello. Quick show of hands. I know I can only see hands in the room, but I'm going to make that as a unbiased sampling. Okay, joke intended. The question was like, I wanted to get a sense of how well versed you were in machine learning. So if you were to talk about deep learning, how many of you would say you understand the internals? Okay, right, okay. So if I were to talk about biases in machine learning, how many of you would say you understand it? Okay, right. So this is what I'm going to do. Given the sample I have, I'm assuming that you're moderately technical. At any point in time, if you want something more from me, so think of this as like a tip of the iceberg thing. I'm just explaining everything at a very high level. So I would love to talk to you about details, but given time, and I don't know how much you know, I've held it back. So if at any point in time you think it's useful for everybody in the room, you should consider everybody in the room, right? I'll find it useful. Put your hand up. I'll try my level best. Okay?
Real quick, students, please close your laptops during guest lecture.
So the whole thesis that's happening here is very obvious to you. We are in Silicon Valley, all the companies around here, and you know how the world looks, right? At least in this part of the world, right? So this is all based on an arbitrage on privacy, right? Why do I say that? So the big four actually have access to very large amounts of data. So what is the business model all about? If you think about Google, it's actually delivering optimized search results, right? And flip that around, that becomes ads, and that's their revenue, right? Facebook, okay, we were talking about it today, right? It's like giving you ads and monetizing that. Amazon, they do that in the physical space, right? Instead of actually giving you your search results, they want you to have what you want in the real world. They're optimizing your needs in the real world. And what does Twitter do, right? Again, like you want to have that, your brain has the dopaminergic senses and you want to have the buzz. And Twitter is literally feeding you with that, right? So this is what all of them are doing. And how do they all do this? And what has been the driver behind all this? So this was a paper that came out, and it kind of gives you like a very good idea about why I thought I should talk about privacy. So there are like three things that actually prevents or controls who gets into the space, right? Firstly, is this CPUs or the hardware, right? So the hardware, you can get access to it. I mean, pretty much, there's just a pricing question. Whether it's Intel or AMD, you still can get access to CPUs or GPUs, and then you can do that. Then the second thing is the set of people who have expertise in machine learning, deep learning techniques, right? Like, DeepMind, when it started out, they actually hired half of the world's population who had expertise in that. But that population has increased, and now you have a better chance of actually getting it. Again, this is arbitrage there, right? Where do you actually find the top experts in anything? It's an arbitrage. But the more important, the most important thing that we should notice is the data mode. What that means is like whoever who has access to the largest amount of data has the most advantage, right? So what does it mean for privacy? What that means for privacy is like everybody who wants to compete has an incentive to get more data. And where does the data come from? It's all of us, right? So this is a question that we have to think about, right? So I just thought I'll give you an example, right? So as more and more devices get into the world, literally, we already know this. Like most of the time when you're talking in your house, whatever you're saying is already known to at least 10 recommender engines, 100 other instances, right? And why do you think we should start worrying about this, right? Because of this. Have anyone of you actually saw this book? Oh, it's an interesting read. It's a very thick one, so it's definitely a bedtime read. It can also swap in for a pillow, but it's it's pretty interesting. The reason I say this, you should actually at least have a quick look of this, is like it describes this paradigm shift where you actually get data from people and convert that into value, and that value is actually used to give returns to the shareholders, right? So this is the question. This is a typical economics question, like supply versus demand, right? And there's always a supply, and the demand is going up and up. Now, I'm going to skip a bit, and I'm going to talk slightly differently because I think I'm going a bit slow. So the thing I wanted to describe to you was the following. Given any data set, it is a half-life, right? So, imagine your address, right? Your address is going to change over time. In the UK, the half-life is like less than 3 years. So essentially, if you have an address, like 3 years' time, half the population will have changed the address. And it actually happens both ways, right? It actually helps somebody to update their database because all of this has implications to the individual in question. It's a double-sided problem, right? So let me explain what this means. So imagine you have a credit score. You know how the credit score is being calculated, right? So if anything gets bounced off and your address that's been actually in there is different from that's actually physically there, guess what happens to your credit score? And imagine the implications of that to your life, right? When we talk about privacy, we generally think, okay, privacy has limited impact, but it's changing significantly. I'm just giving you examples where, your privacy, your lack of privacy or privacy being breached, or whichever the way you think about it, has economic implications to what you do and how you are. So I wanted to actually give you a bit of a notion before diving in deep. This is just to give you the fact that everything that I'm going to talk about is slightly controversial. So there's two sides to the argument. So, there is a bunch of people who are very, very good. These are the people who actually created parts of cryptography, especially elliptical cryptography. And these people don't really believe that, provable security is something that's worth its whatever. But most of what we actually have as solutions to privacy preserving mechanisms in machine learning space happen to be in this bucket. So I thought I should actually be full disclosure, put my hand up, give you the notion of what I'm going to talk about before I take you into it, right? So in general, whenever you talk about any mechanism, you have this question of an adversary, right? Who is it that you consider an adversary who is acting against you in this situation? Is it Facebook? Is it Google? Is it Twitter? Or is it a governmental agency? Each of them has different sets of parameters, different sets of mechanisms that you require, right? And typically speaking, what is actually happening is like most of the mechanisms that you find in the academic literature actually has this random oracle model, right? And I'm assuming everybody knows about oracle models, right? Oracle or Delphi. Okay. I'm not sure whether it's Greek or Roman mythology, but you actually have some animal being sacrificed. The internal organs of the animal is supposed to tell you about the future, right? So instead of that, you actually have a mechanism by which you ask a question and get an answer, right? So effectively what you would say is like, imagine you encrypt something and send it across. You have this adversary who actually has this ability to look at what it is. And there's a random oracle that you can actually ask questions and find answers to, right? So I just want to give you like a notion of normally how you look at adversary capabilities. So first is in part inference and the other part is in training. Let me try to describe this. So firstly is when they actually collect the data, right? What can you actually do to change the dynamic of a game when you collect data? Second is when they actually really do something. There's if you are really academically inclined, there's a paper called Security and Privacy in Machine Learning, SOK, it's a paper that's worth a read, but I'm not assuming anybody has any time to read that. But if you're really interested, it's a good point to start from. It gives you like a flavor of what's there, what's happening. At least gives you options about what you can actually do in the future. It's like imagine you are on a hot seat, right? You are somebody responsible for actually looking after privacy in machine learning. What are the choices you have? You had 30 minutes to read something, right? 30 minutes is a bit too much, but yeah, that would be the paper I would recommend that you have a read. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So generally speaking, this is what you actually have for machine learning models and how you attack them, right? So there are different kinds of attacks you do, right? So you actually can have like reconstruction attacks. Okay, let me try give you the notion of what it means, right? Sometimes in an attack, what you want to know is a particular person is part of the group or not, right? And you might find this interesting. Like imagine like there's a particular group that's there. That could be you having a disease or not having a disease. Whether you have it or you don't have it. All you need to do is to find out whether you have a membership to the group or not. So that's an interesting thing. The other thing is like, if you have some model and you actually have like some insights into what the model actually contains. Let's say, imagine the feature set. You want to actually find out what that is, right? So these are the kind of attacks that they normally do, but I'm not going to go details into it. So I'll give you like a notion of key things that people generally talk about. One of the key things that people talk about is differential privacy. This is a very interesting notion. It's a statistical notion that if you actually make some changes to a data set, can you actually really recognize it? There's a lady called Cynthia Dock. She actually has a monogram on this topic. Again, anybody who's completely bored, you can actually get an electronic copy of that, right? You could read that, very, very dense, mathematical, and very much worth a read, okay? I would really recommend if you get really interested. Again, just to give you an idea, right? This is typically what you do. You actually change the inputs, you change the output, you actually have algorithms to change it. And there are other techniques that you would do. Effectively, you can think of it this way. You're given two boxes. Can you actually recognize with a very high probability box A or box B has been changed? That's essentially how the notion of privacy is. So what will happen is like most of the statistical attacks that you have will fail if you have differential privacy, okay? So say if there's some bias in sampling, and if you actually do this kind of, measures, it'll reduce it if it's done properly, right? So, okay, now I'm going to talk about something that you probably all have in your hand. How many of you actually have an Android phone? Okay, do you guys know how the key prediction is done? The model by which it updates? Okay, no, okay, I'll try to explain this, okay? So literally what happens here is like each of your phones actually have a machine learning model that actually gets updated by the way you type, right? There's a data set that actually resides in your machine, and there's a global model, right? And what effectively a federated model allows you to do is update the model globally and locally. Essentially what that means is like when you type in, your algorithm learns locally and also learns globally. And you get some feedback back from the global to a local. So it improves all the time. At the same time, to a degree, it preserves your privacy. It's not updating all the data that you actually are using to learn. That make sense? Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I should probably add a bit of caveat to that. So there are techniques by which this could be broken, but I just want to be sure that, it's a technique that's been proposed. There are improvements to this. Split learning is another one. They actually broke it down to different pieces. So some of the attacks are not possible. But it's like, it's always good to see approaches happening rather than, the absolute answer to it. Yeah, it's a journey in that sense. Okay, this is the more interesting bit. This is the bit I like the most, right? So, generally speaking, if you go to Google, you put anything in, Google knows what you're searching for, right? Everybody's seen this, right? Like, you search for a flight ticket, your Gmail has all the ads, right? So imagine this, right? And again, his PhD thesis is awesome, and it's printed out and it's out there. If you really are bored to death and you want something, Craig Gentry's PhD thesis. He's an IBM researcher. He's the guy who actually first proposed this thing. So you can actually have a search mechanism where you submit something to Google and Google doesn't know what the hell you're searching, but they still return a valid result, right? That's homomorphic encryption. So you can think of it simply as a sense where, you have an operation that's homomorphic, right? So imagine you have g to the power a mod n, and then you have g to the power b mod n. And you can actually do that multiplication, that's a plus b, right? Loosely speaking. So that's pretty much intuitively how it would work. It's a homomorphic function. So other thing that's pretty interesting, and this is one of my fun topics, I really love it because of the power it actually has. I'll explain it in that sense. So zero knowledge proofs are going to be one of the tools that you will have in toolset. I'll explain how that would probably help you. Multiple ways. Firstly, imagine you have a machine learning model. Let's talk about Google, right? When Google's search algorithm happens, there is actually a whole bunch of features that nobody knows, right? Imagine you had a mechanism by which you could actually prove to somebody that these are the feature set or these feature sets are not being used. The same will apply to Facebook, right? So imagine somebody actually gives you a submission of something, prove to somebody that this has actually gone through this process without revealing what the process is, right? So I'm going to give you an example of how this would work, right? Imagine this room only had one door, right? So I make a claim to Tarun, I have this magical ability to escape from this room with one door. And he says, okay, show it to me, right? What do? So I go to the room with one door. I am the prover, and Tarun is the verifier. I walk in, he closes the door behind me, right? And he waits. If I magically get out of the room without using the door, he knows that I have the ability to escape, right? That my claim is true. That's all it says. But it never reveals how I do it, right? Understand the concept, right? And imagine that this is very important because imagine when you authenticate yourself to Google, right? You actually give a password. Once the password is revealed, anybody could actually use that to play back, right? This is interesting. And again, anytime you do something and you reveal it, when the adversary knows what it is, your advantage is gone, right? So I really like three things about zero knowledge proofs. And the two bits that are most interesting is completeness and soundness. Okay, imagine in a world where you actually have zero knowledge proofs, right? So you be very, very sure that if you tell the truth, whoever you are telling the truth to will be convinced. And you can only convince somebody if and only if you tell the truth. It's a thought experiment, and that's the proof. You can read the paper if you want, but do you get the notion of what I'm saying? So you have a very interesting situation. You can say to somebody something, and two things happen. One is you can only prove to them that whatever is true if you tell the truth, and as long as you tell the truth at some point in bounded time, the person will know that's actually true, right? Okay, now I'll skip this because there's no time. Again, you can actually have an electronic copy of this because there's a print copy. I have a print copy, but I will really recommend if you get really interested, both for multi-party compute and for zero knowledge proofs. This is a pretty good book, slightly thick. Again, you can get an electronic copy, but worth a read. So there are two things I wanted to describe so at least you get a notion of what zero knowledge proofs are. One is I wanted to talk to you about snarks. Another one I wanted to talk to you about stocks. So the proof I was describing previously is an interactive proof. So I have to interact with Tarun to prove to him that I have the ability to do whatever. Imagine I don't have to actually do that, right? One short interaction. I just say something, here's the proof, done, right? Normally a signature scheme, right? So there is one like that, and that's called snark, okay? It's succinct, non-interactive argument of knowledge, right? So you can actually have a proof, a zero knowledge proof, where you don't really have to, do interactions, right? So now the question is how big it is, how difficult it is. So it's usable. We have Zcash actually using it, and a whole bunch of people have been doing lots of interesting stuff. And then there's this. This actually has slightly better characteristics. Again, I should warn you, the snarks actually require a setup. Essentially what that means is like the first time you want to do this, you have to interact with the verifier before you can actually prove it multiple times, right? So in a stark sense, you don't have to do that. And the security of that is slightly different. Okay, all right. Okay, this is the bit that's more down to earth, more pragmatic, right? So imagine all the rest of the other things were not really working, but you have existing mechanisms. So one of the things that existing mechanisms that you already have at your hand is the TPMs, right? This is a TPM, right? So what it does is like, it actually has this ability to store some data and actually verify it whenever you ask. So you might ask, why is this useful, right? So imagine you made a statement about something and you give the proof of whatever it is. Then anytime it actually breaks that proof, you will know that's no longer valid. So you could think of actually as this being your, how could I say, your proxy. The proxy that you don't see, you don't talk to, but acts as your proxy, right? So if you had like a privacy preserving machine learning technique being applied, you provide the proof that this is how it's being deployed, but you're not there when everything is being run, right? Nobody is there, I mean, in that sense. Nobody that's not incentivized by a set of entities to monitor it is there, or not being biased is there to actually look after it. So you need a mechanism to do this. So this is like one of those mechanisms, right? So generally speaking, okay, quick show of hands. How many of you know the boot sequence? When a machine boots up. Okay, so ignore, oh, okay, one, okay, right. So ignore this piece. Essentially all it does is like, if you know that a particular machine is in a particular state, you have an ability to make sure that every time it boots up, you can check it, right? This is like the static one, and there's a dynamic version of it. And obviously, given that I play around with blockchains, I have to talk about blockchains, right? So I'll give you a very simple example of how you could actually do this. And this is pretty much giving you a flavor of this concept called data markets, right? So the concept of a data market is like, if you have some data, you will have people who will actually, say what they want and how much they are willing to pay for. And assuming you have privacy preserving machine learning techniques over there, you will have some amount of the, benefit being returned, right? So the question here is like, how do you actually bootstrap anything, right? When you have some data, how do you know whether any data is of any value? There's no way to do that, right? So somebody has to actually go in and say, okay, this data is good. So this is a blockchain-y way of doing it. So the way I would say is like, you take normally bets, right? No, somebody walks into a room and says to you, you know what? I saw a UFO flying. And you go, no way, I'm betting 100 quid, right? That's exactly what it is. So imagine somebody turns up and says this, you know what? This is what it is. So the person who actually bets for it will actually win whenever that statement turns out to be true. If it turns out to be false, they lose, right? And whatever that's being staked will be distributed. And you might ask, why do you need a blockchain? The reason you need a blockchain is essentially, you don't need to trust anybody to make sure that this distribution happens, and the decision happens, and distribution is done automatically. Make sense? So you have a smart contract, you transfer the value that you're betting, you make encode into it, whatever the conditional statement is. Again, there's this question of, do you need an oracle, right? Remember the oracle. Oracles are very powerful, okay? You always will come across oracles all the time. And in blockchain too, we have lots of oracles. And so, if it's something that could be easily verifiable, a Boolean of some kind, you don't probably need an oracle. But otherwise, you would definitely need an oracle. So I'll give you an example. Imagine a kind of an insurance, like flight insurance, right? Whenever you fly, you have an insurance, right? So your insurance is normally done by humans. So is there anyone in this room who actually claimed an insurance for delayed flight? Okay, right, good. So there you go. So this tells you what happens, right? Every time you buy a ticket, they sell you an insurance. But of the possibility that you will be able to get the money whenever that delayed is there, it's like very small. I'll give you an example where you can actually delegate this to a smart contract and how this happens. So when you buy your insurance, what's going to do is you're actually doing this, right? You're staking, right? And literally what is going to happen is the insurance provider should put the rest of the money. So if you say, if the delay happens, I'll give you 600 quid, US dollars maybe. So you put $20 into it, right? The 580 goes in from those guys, right? When your flight is delayed, a very small probability, let's assume that's the case, then they lose the money. Generally speaking, the money never gets to you. Why? Because there's a process that's missing, right? If you have a smart contract, the value is in there, and now you require an oracle. Why do you require an oracle? Conditional statement in the insurance normally would say, generally speaking, if there are any weather incidents, they won't pay you. So you need an oracle that tells them whether there was an adverse weather condition that prevents the flight from going through, right? If that's the case, you lose it. But otherwise, you should have your money in your wallet by the time the flight is delayed, okay? So there you go, I kind of described. So my stupid summary, very important one of the last one, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Privacy is not going to come to you for free. And there is a lot of things that's happening. We haven't reached a point where the privacy preserving machine learning techniques have turned out to be economically viable. So what that means is like, can you actually have a privacy preserving version of Facebook, and can it compete economically with Facebook? At this moment in time, my answer would be no. At the point in time when that happens, all these conversations will be very, very, very interesting. Okay, that's it, my first half. So if you have any questions, I'm here.